Hello, I'm glad you've joined us today as we continue to study the Gospel of Mark. Today we pick up in Mark chapter 15 where Jesus is delivered to Pilate. In our previous study, you remember Jesus had been betrayed by Judas and then led to a mockery of a trial by the Jewish leaders, and he'd been sentenced to death for blasphemy. Now in chapter 15 and verse 1 it says, "Early in the morning the chief priests and the elders and the scribes, the whole council, immediately held consultation, binding Jesus. They led him away to be delivered up to Pilate. And Pilate questioned him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And answering him, he said, 'It is as you say.' And the chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Pilate was questioning him again, saying, 'Do you make no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?' But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now, at the feast, he used to release for one of them, of the prisoners whom they requested. And the man named Barabbas had been in prison with insurrectionists and who had committed murder in insurrection. And the multitude went up and began to ask him to do as he had accustomed to do for them. And Pilate answered them, saying, 'Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?' For he was aware that the chief priests had delivered him up because of envy. But the chief priests stirred up the multitude to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. And answering again, Pilate was saying to them, 'Then what shall I do with him whom you call the king of the Jews?' And they shouted back, 'Crucify him.' But Pilate was saying to them, 'Why? What evil has he done?' But they shouted out all the more, 'Crucify him.' And wishing to satisfy the multitude, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he delivered him to be crucified. The soldiers took him away into the palace, that is, the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort, and they dressed him up in purple, and after weaving a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to acclaim, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they kept beating him in the head with a reed and spitting at him and kneeling down before him. And after they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off of him and put his garments on him, and they led him out to be crucified." Here we continue to see the events leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. And as we said in our last study, we saw the mockery of a trial there late at night by the Jewish leaders. And after wrongly accusing him and without evidence of doing anything wrong, they condemned him to death. And now they take Jesus to have a hearing before Pilate, the Roman governor of the region. The reason they do this is because the Jews, having been conquered by the Romans, are not allowed to execute capital punishment. And so the Jewish leaders must take Jesus to Pilate, and they do so here in the very early hours of the morning, getting Pilate up and trying to persuade him to pronounce and execute the sentence of death upon Jesus. Now, Mark in his account gives a condensed review of the things that take place here. We see other things listed in Matthew and in the Gospel of John. But in the picture that Mark gives us, he gives us the essentials. We see the malice of the rulers, we see the fickleness of the people, we see the moral cowardice of Pilate, and above all we see the supreme majesty of Jesus. We've seen the corruption of the leaders, these rulers who are envious of Jesus. We've seen it from the beginning. And it's only gotten worse and worse as Jesus has pointed out their hypocrisy and their wickedness. And they're willing to do anything. They're willing to break any law and accuse someone who has done no wrong to God or man of things he had never done, and they're willing to put him to death even though he's completely innocent. They take Jesus before Pilate, and they have no accusations really to make before Pilate because Jesus has done nothing wrong. They've accused him of blasphemy, but they don't mention that to Pilate. That's something that Pilate wouldn't have been concerned with at all. To Pilate, they make the accusation that he is an insurrectionist against Rome, accusing him of claiming to be king. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "You say." It is as you say. And John, in his account, in chapter 18 of his gospel, shows that Jesus explains that his kingdom is not of this world. If his kingdom were of this world, then his servants would be fighting. But as it is, his kingdom is not of this realm. Pilate sees that there's nothing that he is doing or has been accused of that is true. He sees through it. It makes mention that he sees that the reason that the Jewish leaders has brought him up is because they're just envious of him. These are false accusations. Probably when he's asked him, "Do you not make any other statement concerning these things?" They were vehemently accusing of things, maybe tearing down the temple, other false things. But Jesus saying nothing else to Pilate in reply, to the point that Pilate's even amazed. It tells us there, verse 6, that at the feast, Pilate would release a prisoner that they would request. He did this to appease them, to make them happy. He wanted to keep peace there. There was a man, it says in verse 7, by the name of Barabbas, who had been in prison with some insurrectionists and who was guilty of committing murder in that insurrection. And the multitude, they went up and asked Pilate to do what he accustomed to do in releasing someone. Pilate asked, "Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" It says he was aware that the chief priests had just delivered him up because of their envy, and he thought maybe that the people would want Jesus to be released, and very likely that they would have chosen Jesus, of course, over Barabbas. But he ends up releasing Barabbas because the people, the Bible says, had been stirred up by the chief priests. They're very fickle, and they use this mob mentality and stirring them up to call and get their way. Pilate tries at first to release Jesus. He sees that he's done nothing wrong, and he's not that he really wants to do the Jews a favor. He hates the Jews. He hates being there, no doubt. He would have been in Caesarea at his governor's residence, but it's Passover. Thousands and thousands of Jews from everywhere come to Jerusalem, and he has to keep the peace. And here are these Jewish leaders, and they're stirred up, and they're stirring up the people, and it's the first thing in the morning, and they're wanting Jesus to be crucified. They've gotten the people all tore up about him. And to have good relations, he's going to overlook justice and let things go just to keep peace. He's a politician. It doesn't really matter to him. He tries to release Jesus, knowing that's what he should have done, but rather he turns and does their bidding. Other accounts of the gospel say, if you release him, you're no friend of Caesar, and he doesn't want that to get back to Caesar, and then he's not keeping peace, and he's done something against Caesar that would cost him his job. So he washes his hands of the whole affair and lets justice go. He has no morals to him. He's a coward. Here we see just how fickle people can be. We see that in our society. Crowds are stirred up to do the wrong thing, and sometimes not even knowing what they're participating in, just because they're stirred up as a crowd. We see their change, their sentiment, that it is just incredible, the change that they have. Their choice is going to be fatal. Earlier, they were very enthusiastic in supporting Jesus. Just less than a week earlier, they'd been crying hosannas. They were wanting to hail him as Messiah and King. But again, there, verse 11, they were easily influenced by these wicked chief priests who'd stirred up the crowd against Jesus. Jesus had warned about their hypocrisy, but the people followed. And these chief priests used the treacherous temper of the crowd that turned against one who had done no wrong to anyone. And so now they're crying out for Jesus to be put to death, crucify him. And they asked rather for Barabbas, who had been imprisoned as an insurrectionist and one who had committed murder, to be released instead of Jesus. So because of the hate and because of their envy, these Jewish leaders falsely accused Jesus before Pilate of being an insurrectionist, and in turn called for Pilate to release someone who was actually guilty of insurrection and murder. And Pilate, in his willingness to please the Jews, again with his moral cowardice, washes his hands of the whole thing, lets justice go, and gives Jesus to be crucified. He's given to the soldiers, and verse 15 says, wishing to satisfy the multitude, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and having Jesus scourged, he delivered him to be crucified. Soldiers took away to the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort, all the soldiers that were there, come together. They mock. They hate to be there too. They hate the Jews. And here's one who claimed to be the king of the Jews, and they're going to use, they're very hardened, many of them very wicked men. And they dress him up in a purple robe. They weave a crown of thorns and press it into his scalp. And this is all after being scourged. It just says, the Bible doesn't go into the details. It just says they scourged him. We're so far removed from that kind of treatment that we can hardly imagine what was going on. To scourge someone, many times they were tied to the post, their clothes taken off, and then they were beaten with a whip that had several thongs at the end, and they were embedded with bone and pieces of metal. And when whipped with this, it would just completely tear the flesh. Some people died from scourging. The Jewish law would only allow 40 lashes. Beyond that, the one who was doing the scourging could be punished, but there's no limitation on the Romans as to how many lashes they would give. And this was done to Jesus. We can hardly imagine the pain of having the flesh ripped and torn away by this scourging. Then upon his beaten, bloody body, they placed this purple robe, weaved this crown of thorns, as we said, pressed it into his scalp, mocking him, crying out, "Hail, King of the Jews," it says. And they kept beating him in the head with a reed. And they were spitting on him and kneeling down before him, mocking him. We can only imagine the pain and the suffering that Jesus went through being treated like this. Then they took the robe off. We can imagine the time they were beating him, the blood clotting and sticking to this, and then they jerk it off and then put his clothes back on him and lead him out to be crucified. Some very terrible things done to Jesus, not because he deserved any of it. He allowed it to happen to himself for our sakes. Did not because he had to, but because we needed him to. So that he could die as a sacrifice and face death, face the penalty that we should face. It helps us again understand better 2 Corinthians chapter 5 than that chapter where it talks about God allowing him to be sin on our behalf that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So many things to be ashamed of that this was done for us, and yet so many things to be thankful for, that Jesus was willing to go through this for us that we might be saved. Our time's up for today. We'll begin next time looking at the crucifixion of Jesus as he led to Calvary. And until then, I hope you'll have a good day.